Hi guys, Brian from Marron Boas here. It seems to me like many boa keepers are obsessed with their boa's bathroom behavior. And frequently I get questions like, my boa hasn't pooped in over 4 weeks. Should I be concerned? Well, today I want to answer all of the questions that you have about boa poop, but were afraid to ask. So stay tuned for a dissertation on dung and an expose on excrement. If you're new to the channel, this is the place for information about all aspects of keeping and breeding boa constrictors in captivity. So if you want to learn more about these amazing animals, be sure to subscribe to the channel. So first, a little boa anatomy. Boas have a single opening at the base of their tail that's called the cloaca, also known as the vent. And this is a dual purpose opening, so it serves both reproductive as well as elimination functions. So if you look on this male VPIT positive boa, his cloaca is right here at the base of his tail. It's actually, you can tell by the fact that there's the 2 spurs on either side, and it's pretty obvious that there's an opening right there. And so if this male is going to mate, his hemipenes, which are inverted into his tail, will actually pop out inside out like a sock, and then one of the hemipenes will be inserted into the female's cloaca to fertilize the eggs. But it's also where boas poop out of. Boa poop is a little bit different from poop from a mammal because it's actually got 2 components. So as you probably know, mammals excrete urea in a liquid form dissolved in the urine, whereas reptiles like birds, they don't excrete liquid urea. They actually have a solid or semi-solid form of urea that's excreted. And this looks like either white or off-white pellets, or sometimes it's kind of a chalky, kind of semi-solid consistency. In addition to the urea, they also excrete feces, which normally look brown or black in color. Sometimes they can be a little bit different in color, which is normally not a problem. Often the feces will contain remnants of the prey items. So you might see pieces of fur or feathers if you fed the boa birds. You might also see little pieces of bone. And this is normal to see in the feces. There may also be some mucus present and sometimes liquid water. If your boa has a lot of water that it's trying to eliminate, there might be some, there's often copious amounts of liquid water that are expelled as well. Now we get to the million-dollar question. How often should your boa poop? Well, in general, boas poop about once every 1 to 4 weeks. And they typically will expel pretty much the entire meal that they've digested in one sitting. It's, sometimes it's spread out into 2 sessions over the course of a few days. But in a healthy boa, the pooping cycle is pretty well timed as far as the feeding cycle. So if you have a boa that eats every 2 weeks, you would expect it to poop about once every 2 weeks. And this will generally happen about a week or 2 after feeding. And the amount of times that a boa poops will vary depending on its age and what type of boa it is. In general, boas poop less than other snakes. They're less active and they don't move around as much, and they eat less often. As you may know, a lot of colubrid snakes will poop several times a week. Indigo snakes are famous for pooping a lot and for being very messy and kind of smelly. Luckily, boas don't poop quite as much, and the poop isn't as stinky. But when we look at different types of boas, in general, the more active, more elongated arboreal boas, like this Pearl Island Boa, generally poop more often. They move around more, they will digest their food faster, and so they poop more often. Some other types of boas that are more sedentary and not as active, and in general, these boas have kind of more of a thick, stocky body build, like a Bolivian Ambarale boa. These boas will poop less often. And red tail boas in general will poop less often. But as a rule of thumb, you should expect that your boa will have a pretty substantial poop every 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the age and the type of boa. Younger boas in general will poop more often. So if you have a baby boa that's eating every 2 weeks, you would expect a pretty substantial bowel movement about every 2 weeks or so. An adult boa that's eating once a month might only poop substantially once a month. In general, the defecation session in a healthy boa will occur about 1 to 3 weeks after it eats a meal. And then, as I mentioned, they generally will expel most of the contents that have been built up at this time. So some keepers will actually write down when their boas poop. They want to time the next feeding based on the pooping. And this is a good idea if you have the bandwidth to do this, especially for small boas, especially like baby red tail boas. Because if you feed a baby boa too much, especially a red tail, and it gets backed up, it's going to regurgitate the food out the front end. So you want to make sure that there's room in the digestive tract to process the incoming food so that you don't end up having a regurgitation. So generally, if you don't feed more than once every 2 weeks for baby boas, you're not likely to have regurgitations. But if you're feeding weekly, you really increase the chances you're going to have a regurgitation. I did a video previously on regurgitation. It's something you want to try to avoid at all costs. But if you write down when the animals are pooping, you can time the feeding to happen after the animal evacuates itself, and thus you'll greatly reduce your odds of having a regurgitation event. The longest I've heard of a boa going in between pooping is about 6 months. My friend had a boa constrictor almirali that for whatever reason just didn't want to poop. And when it finally went, the 1.5 foot long turd was quite a sight to behold. So when exactly does pooping become pathological? Well, in general, you can think of a boa that doesn't poop for a long time as either being constipated or having an obstruction. So I'm going to share some tips for how to relieve a constipated boa. But if none of these tips work, your boa might have a more serious medical issue, more serious obstruction. There might be something in there blocking the normal bowel movements, or it might have something anatomically wrong with it. So you should definitely seek out a vet, a qualified reptile vet, if these tips fail for you. But the first tip that I would use on a boa that's constipated is to soak it in lukewarm water. You probably want to put in a tub of water a few inches deep, so just enough to cover the boa's body, and let it soak in the water for about an hour or two, lukewarm water. And this almost always will help the boa pass the feces. You may need to go back and repeat this treatment a few days later if your boa hasn't passed all of the feces that have built up. Another tip to get a constipated boa pooping is to encourage movement and activity. In its cage, you want to have plenty of climbing structures, branches and driftwood, and hiding places that it can explore and climb over, just so it moves around a lot. And you also probably want to take your boa out, like I'm holding this boa, and just let it explore and move around. And often a vigorous handling session will stimulate your boa to evacuate the contents of its bowels. Some people report giving boas a belly massage, which seems to aid in elimination. Basically, you just hold the boa like this, and you kind of let the boa crawl over your arm just to put a little bit of stimulation on its belly. You know, hopefully we're kind of stimulating the poop to move towards the exit. I haven't needed to do this, but it makes sense that it might work. But basically, you just want your boa to move around more, which will often help with its elimination. Other tips that you might want to consider are increasing the humidity in the enclosure, using a substrate that favors higher humidity, like coconut husk bedding, and also increasing the temperature a few degrees. Constipated boas are often dehydrated, which is one of the reasons why soaking them helps them to poop. But you may want to put more water in your boa's diet. You may also want to soak the prey items in water before you give it. So after you thaw the rat or mouse, you might want to soak it in water and then feed the wet animal to your boa to give it more water. And you may also want to put a larger water dish in its enclosure. Sometimes boas will like to defecate in their water dish, and if they can get in there and soak, it might help with the elimination. Just be sure to monitor the water dish and clean it out thoroughly and sterilize it as soon as your boa takes a crap in it. Proper planning can prevent pathological pooping. And if you've tried all these tricks and it's been a month or two and your boa still hasn't pooped, especially if it's not eating or if it regurgitated or if its back end is starting to really swell up, you definitely want to seek out a qualified reptile vet because you have a more serious issue going on, which is going to require veterinary intervention. So one topic I want to comment on is the color of the poo, and color of boa poo will sometimes vary. So it's typically brownish or blackish. Sometimes it has a kind of a greenish tint, or sometimes even a whitish or yellowish tint. And often it might vary depending on the diet that you're feeding your boa. So if you are normally feeding rodents, but you feed small chicken or quail or something like that, the poo might look a little different, and also the consistency might be a little more liquidy. In general, these aren't big deals, so you might want to monitor your boa's poop as far as the color and consistency. If you have an abrupt change that you don't understand, you might want to seek out a veterinary advice. For example, if your boa has poo that's red, it might be some blood in the stool. Or if your boa has poop that's kind of a greenish color, it might indicate that there might be something going on. Although often these minor variations in the color of your boa's poo is really nothing to be worried about. Many beginning boa keepers mistake a regurgitation for a poo. And regurgitation is something different. It comes not out from the back end of the boa, but it gets regurgitated from the front end of the boa. And regurgitation in general is something you should definitely be concerned about. So I did a whole video on regurgitation, so check that out. But the most common cause of regurgitation is feeding boas, especially baby boas, too frequently. So if you look in your boa's cage approximately 3 to 4 days after it feeds, and you see a wet, slimy looking, just slightly digested rodent, that's likely to be a regurgitation. The smell of the regurgitation is also something that is very characteristic, and it's a really, really bad smell. It's about as bad of a smell as you can smell. So while a boa's feces don't smell great, the smell of regurgitation is far, far worse. Feces also generally arrive anywhere from a week to 3 weeks after the feeding. And as I mentioned before, so regurgitation happens quite a bit sooner. So that should tip you off whether or not you have a regurgitation or it's a defecation event. One final comment I wanted to make is that I've noticed, at least anecdotally, that a lot of my boas appear to defecate as soon as I change the substrate in their cage. So this is even if they had previously defecated not too soon before that, which leads me to think, I'm wondering if they actually will mark their territory. Maybe somehow they defecate on the new substrate to kind of advertise to other boas that this is my territory, you know, stay out. So there's a lot about boa behavior and communication that we don't understand. So I'm wondering if you guys have seen similar behaviors in your boas where they will defecate right on new substrate in order to maybe mark their territory. And this might also be a way that you can get your boa to poop if it's constipated. So that was an expose on boa poop. I hope this was somewhat helpful. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot me a line. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.